Hi everyone, I hope that you're all doing well. In this lecture, I want to discuss with you an important technique in qualitative methods in sociology, but also the social sciences generally, and that is known as ethnography. So the plan is that we're going to talk today about ethnography in general, and then we'll discuss in a little bit more detail ethnography in actual practice. We don't have time to do ethnography in this class as a method of our own, but because this is such a widely used method in qualitative analysis, it's important that you understand how it works. So we'll start with the definition of ethnography. So what is ethnography? Well, it's a subset of qualitative data analysis. Here's a particularly sort of poignant description of it. It is the science devoted to describing the ways of life of humankind. That's a classic paper, Vittich and Lyman from 1994, but here's some other kind of attempts at a definition: the study of groups and people as they go about their everyday lives. Here's a longer one from Lange 2013. Ethnographic methods have two distinct components. The first is concerned with how to gather data from participant observation and interviews, and the second component deals with how to analyze and present the findings. So, what's the key unifying feature of these definitions? It's that we have longer observation of subjects, greater immersion of the researcher. Basically, this is the default method in anthropology. So, in some sense, you are going to live among a set of people. You have very long observation of subjects. Long, of course, is relative, but this would be the sort of longest time that any method spends on subjects compared to, say, a survey method or some kind of interview project, etc. And there's typically much more observation of people as they go about their typical routine. So there's less emphasis than in any other method on what people are saying to you, and there's more emphasis on what it is they're actually doing. So, why would we ever use such methods? Well, in the first case, it simply allows more data collection vis a vis simple interviews. But the researcher might also gain a new dimension of data by participating or simply observing as opposed to just asking about. So there's a lot of little advantages to ethnography. It's easier to, say, check facts with more time. You can verify the validity of what people are saying to you. And it's easier to chip away at SDRB, or social desirability response bias. In other words, you're less likely to be fooled in some respect by participants. By the way, I don't want it to sound like we're taking a hoity toity attitude towards participants where we're looking down on people and second guessing them. If you or I were a research subject, you or I would probably be pretty fickle and ornery about a number of things. And if people are studying us and we consent to be studied, we might agree, even if we don't like it, that we're more likely to be honest in certain ways if we're observed over a long period of time, as opposed to just asked, how do you feel about, say, the controversial political topic in your community. But instead, if people observe us and observe how we talk to neighbors about it, or if we do or don't go to a particular political demonstration, etc., this might be a more reliable way to gather data. So, if these methods are so great, as I often structure these discussions, why would we ever not do them? And of course, there are some drawbacks. So, one of them would be the challenge of generalization. This is common to qualitative methods, but it can become more extreme with ethnography since you typically have fewer participants. There's a counterpoint here, which is that if the phenomenon in question is well established statistically, but the inner workings are simply unknown, you may not need large, randomly selected ends to be plausible. I saw a really interesting study that was written about in the Times recently that had to do with the phenomenon of basically whether or not having a particular like top score on your GPA or on the SAT made you more likely to get into elite universities. And this paper basically established that it, generally speaking, was like a linear function of your household income, so it got a little bit more likely that this top score would help you. And then it kind of bottomed out for a little bit for people on the 80th and 90th percentiles, and then shot up for people near the top percentile. So you might wonder, okay, if generally speaking, having a good score on this test helps you out, but then for some people near but not quite at the top of household income, it actually, that effect goes away. And then for people at the very top, it shoots up. You might want to study that smaller group when you have this really well established statistical phenomenon, but you're really curious about the inner workings. So how is it that this plays out in an actual admissions office? That would be an example of where ethnography could well be used in a very targeted way, and you might just be interested in, a certain subset of elite schools, and you might say, well, the U Chicago isn't a random subset of elite universities, but we just want to see how this plays out in at least one place to help us tell the statistical story. There are some other problems to be concerned about, though. So following up, on the problem of generalization, or the small n, you might be curious about whether or not subjects are actually more honest in these scenarios, or does the researcher become more entangled? What if the researcher gets a bit of Stockholm syndrome and actually is finding it harder and harder to tell fact apart from fiction when they're immersed in this world, when they become friends with the research subjects? And we'll talk in our methods week, or our methods discussion, which is actually later this week, about some notable cases where sometimes researchers even become involved in, or in a legalistic sense, technically speaking, complicit in, accomplices in, illegal activity, including, and this isn't just victimless crimes, but sometimes crimes that have murder victims. And we sort of have to talk about, what does it mean to be objective or neutral in those situations. A more technical note, unlike qualitative analysis generally, where, again, the unifying feature of qualitative analysis is that we try to use people's own words and, generally speaking, draw rich kinds of data from those things. You can do that, of course, by, say, reading people's diaries or journals or that sort of thing if you're allowed to, or if there's, a reasonable kind of warrant for doing that stuff. But ethnographic methods proper are very hard to do for historical data. There's maybe one exception that is kind of a big data thing, which is as there's more and more of social life that's just completely on the internet, completely captured. Arguably, if you say are interested in, I don't know, someone who, some community where there's a lot of like streaming on Twitch or something like that, and you have just tons and tons of raw footage, maybe you could do some kind of digital ethnography. But for the most part, ethnography is difficult to do because that kind of immersive quality of real life is just, we had no approximation of that until the 21st century, basically. So there's really nothing that approximates total immersion in a social world from, say, the 19th century. A diary or a close written account just isn't going to do it. Okay, so let's talk about the practice of ethnographic research. So how does one pick a research site? Of course, we're going to use purposive rather than random or representative sampling here. But how does that work in actuality? So there's a couple of different considerations here that are a little bit different to interview research. One would be accessibility. So because you're asking people for very immersive, possibly invasive access to their lives, choosing a place where the researcher has some rapport or cachet with the community is probably going to be an advantage, and it can also be easier to overcome certain boundaries. There's a disadvantage of this, however, which is that there can be a mystifying effect of some of these taken for granted assumptions, and also the possibility of a conflict of interest. So this accessibility can also blend into that sort of Stockholm syndrome. There's also a sort of subgenre of what's called autoethnography, where people are, studying themselves or studying communities that they have been a part of their whole lives, or in some way are authentic members of the community before starting the ethnography. And again, sometimes this can bring with it a certain amount of narcissism, or a certain amount of simply, lack of the kind of dual consciousness of a sociological researcher. Another method you can use, in addition to accessibility, of course, is just thinking about prior research. And this is where, again, we can sort of use statistical or macro kind of sociological research to help us out. So my example from before about, mysteries in the admissions process that are easy to establish statistically, and it's important to rigorously show that they do exist statistically, but then it's almost a necessity to follow up with qualitative research and ask what's going on there. So when it comes to access, there's kind of an interesting theoretical problem worth noting here, which is how is it that you actually gain access to a community if it's not one that you have this deep immersion in already, which in theory is what produces the kind of useful tension of ethnography, that someone is both an insider and an outsider. There's kind of a well-known discussion in the methodological literature on the role of the gatekeeper. So a rough definition of the gatekeeper would be someone who manages access to the group in some way. These people are important because of who and what they know. So you have formal gatekeepers. These are people that literally have some kind of formal legal right to manage access to a particular site. So some examples of that would be school principals, police chiefs, head chefs, if you want to go in a totally different direction, office managers or hospital administrators. But then you also have these informal gatekeepers. These are people that don't have a formal role or position, but others typically trust them and follow their lead. Here's an example. This is a classic ethnography, Street Corner Society, written by William Foote White. In some ways a precursor to a whole variety of ethnography on the topic of basically people who not live on the street, since that implies that people are homeless, but people that work on the street, so like street vendors, or people that in large urban areas, there's a variety of people who if you just walk about, will see hanging out on the street at all hours of the day. It might be people who are retired. It might be people who sell to those retired individuals. It can be people who are, professional chess hustlers, to name an interest of mine, just all kinds of people. This is a pretty common genre of ethnography. And in this particular ethnography, White encounters this guy named Doc. And Doc is kind of the archetype of this informant or gatekeeper. This is a long bit from Doc. Doc tells White, "You tell me what you want to see and we'll arrange it. When you want some information, I'll ask for it and you listen. When you want to find out their philosophy of life, I'll start an argument and get it for you. If there's something else you want to get, I'll stage an act for you." As you can see, in a lot of these communities, in a whole variety of different communities, in maybe all but the most atypical, it's the case that there are informal structures of power in these communities, and learning to tap those in some way is important for the sake of understanding that community. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about different approaches to how ethnographic research works. The generally speaking kind of key technique here is participant observation, but you can also think about participant observation as sort of a continuum of involvement. So thinking about the degree to which one is a participant observer can be productive in thinking about how you are actually doing ethnography. So you can maybe start on one end with complete researcher entanglement, the complete participant here, to people that are at least ostensibly unattached observers here. We're going to investigate some key points along the spectrum in just a moment, though. So let's talk about participant observation generally. It's fair to say that this is probably the main part of ethnographic research. So this is, if you think about people that are maybe have equal foots in the participant and observer camps, that's the sort of way of approaching ethnography that produces the central productive tension between someone who is participating and has some insider status, because it gives you interactions you would otherwise not observe and questions you wouldn't otherwise ask. But it also helps you maintain some semblance of an analytic distance. And this type of careful observation sort of depends crucially on the extent to which one really is a full participant or not. So this is maybe the sort of central animating methodological problem in a lot of ethnographic research is how much of a participant, how much of an observer should I be? So you can think about certain discrete points on the spectrum. Some of these are kind of straw people, and I'll say a little bit more about why that is, but it still may be helpful conceptually to think about it. So you could be a complete participant. This would make you a fully functioning member of that social setting, and your true identity wouldn't be known to observers in the scenario. This raises a whole host of practical and ethical issues that, broadly speaking, aren't usually worth the trouble, although in some cases they are. You can also think about the sort of status of the participant as observer. So this is similar to being a complete participant, except that members are aware of the researcher's status as a researcher. You're engaged in regular interactions with people, and you basically participate in their daily lives. So when people, there's a phrase that used to be used that's now sort of, it's not really, I suppose it's not offensive for any particular reason, but sometimes avoided. The phrase going native is sometimes associated with this approach. And basically what this means is there's really no attempt to delineate oneself from the people with whom you're with. But there are other approaches as well. So there's also the approach of observer as participant. This is where someone is mainly present as an interviewer, but does some observation with a little bit of participation. Calarco, 2020, whom we'll read later in this class, is a good example of this, I would say. Then you've got the complete observer. So this would be someone that doesn't have direct interaction with people, but they engage in unobtrusive observation in public spaces. So you'll sometimes see this, for instance, in studies of places that are particularly public, where there's not much of an ethical issue, say in sitting around Central Park, for example, and looking at, to use the chess example, how it is that chess hustlers interact with their clientele. But this does have some certain limits, of course. So this and the preceding method can sort of limit people's cognitive empathy. So obviously there's a whole host of complexities associated with this stream of research. Let's dive a little bit further into those. So one thing that's challenging here is the problem of reflexivity, which we'll say a little bit more about generally in a moment, but you can think about this in simple terms as the following problem. You've got the researcher as the research instrument. So what that means is that everything about you, in the words of Desmond 2016, your race, your gender, where and how you are raised, your temperament and disposition can influence whom you meet, what is confided to you, what you're shown, and how you interpret what you see. So there's no real option here besides just embracing the subjectivity and being explicit, reflexive, and critical about it. This wouldn't be a problem if you weren't doing ethnography, but if you're doing ethnography, it's basically a problem. It's just basically as simply complicated as that sounds. To put it in a little bit more prosaic terms, what this means is that research may have a big impact on the researcher and the researched, and the researcher has a big impact on what's happening. This is for a variety of reasons. There's the extended period of time you spend in the field, the deep connections you make with the participants, and in general, just the sort of emotional vulnerability involved in the process. So let's say a little bit more about reflexivity in general. What this means, well, reflexivity is maybe kind of a necessary consequence of the deep embedding of the researcher in the field, but reflexivity generally means taking a look at oneself or putting oneself in the critical mirror. So what this concretely means is considering things such as, how do my characteristics and presence shape the research process? How do they shape my own thoughts about the events in question? Would the events be happening differently if I weren't present or if I had different characteristics? And even if I'm an outsider who gains access to people or a setting, is there value in my outsider status? So is there some merit that comes from being this kind of dual participant who's not a full participant? Here's an example of reflexivity. This comes from Desmond's book. So gender influenced how people behave, blah, blah, blah. The part I wanted to highlight here is really at the very end, when he asks, you ever pretend not to know stuff of the participant, and then says, right then I wondered how often Vanetta had played dumb with me, how often she had faked ignorance to appear more ladylike. So this type of questioning both of the participants, but also considering how you maybe caused that problem, or that's putting it a little bit directly, but how you maybe influence the situation, is an example of the reflexivity. And reflexivity really can be an asset. It increases this credibility of a study, among other reasons, because in a lot of survey research, for instance, researchers don't pay careful enough attention to the code book, even though they certainly could. This is a general failing of a lot of such research. Being reflexive can also work for other purposes. So, for instance, if you care strongly about the participants in your study, as you often might, although sometimes you might be studying people whom you suspect to be engaged in some kind of socially detrimental action, and this may not be a huge concern, but in general, if you feel this set of sort of accountability to your participants, as you probably should as a default, this can be a really good thing because it forces you to think about it. So, for example, forcing you to think about the motivation for the research, what assumptions you're making, how you're connected to the project. But you also want to be careful. So sometimes people use this as a license to be not so much reflexive as just sort of loosey-goosey. You can get a feel for that in that Clifford text. a lot of times, ironically, even though ethnography is a really sort of straightforward technique, people, let's say, they basically kind of get involved in really deep theoretical disputes that sometimes draw them away from concrete questions about reflexivity. So finally, let's talk about a little bit of the practice of ethnography in the sense of how it actually gets done. This is going to be less relevant for us because we're not able to do this in our class, but I do want you to know about these techniques. So writing field notes is a really important part of the ethnographic research process. It can also involve drawing or photographing, so really just any way of capturing concretely what's happening. Some general principles here: the human mind forgets quickly, so you, generally speaking, if you ever conduct this type of research, want to write down as soon as possible what you observed. And you, generally speaking, want to write up full field notes at the very end of the day, if not earlier, so turning those jottings into concrete sort of writing about what you observed. And generally speaking, this should be turned ultimately into memos. So basically, these are just the keys to analyzing the data. They're written documents that summarize different aspects of the research process that are basically like the field notes, except they're turned into more of a narrative and kind of analytical document. And I wanted to wrap up by talking a little bit about digital ethnography, which I mentioned before. So the way that this works differently to, say, the field notes or memos process is that you have kind of an automatic record. And by the way, people often can and do produce tape recordings or video recordings, as I mentioned before, of the events that they observe when they're doing ethnography. But one other reason to take field notes is simply that you can be overwhelmed by the massive data that you have. So just making a guide for yourself is important when you conduct those field notes. But in the case of digital ethnography, that's sort of the default option. But there's a whole variety of different problems here. A lot of times you have body language and social cues that are missing. And again, you still sort of have the problem of, even though you've got this immense mass of online interaction, you still have to sift through the data. And this can also raise a whole variety of new ethical challenges as well, because you've, again, just kind of got this default situation where everything is being recorded, which sort of brings some new ethical issues into play that we'll have time to discuss later. So that's all I wanted to say about ethnography, just a brief introduction to what it is and how it works and why we would use it. Thanks for watching. Looking forward to further discussions.